Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed and today we're going to be having a look at the Eldar, specifically having a look at their history. Now, the history of the Eldar is truly ancient, stretching back millions of years into a half-remembered, semi-mythological past. Much of recorded Eldar history was lost in the Fall, with only a few obscure sources even hinting at the truth of their origins. Many of the Eldar are unsure of their own history, with much remembered through oral tradition via the plays performed by the mysterious webway-travelling Harlequins. Their origin is apparently rooted in the Old Ones, a mysterious species who evolved early into our galaxy's life cycle. They were masters of the warp, and the enemies of the C'tan and the Necrontyr who would eventually become the metallic Necrons. The Old Ones apparently created, or adopted in some stories, the Eldar, giving them their physical form and prestigious psychic powers through their connection to the warp. Although sources are unclear, the Old Ones apparently created the Eldar to fight against the C'tan and the Necrontyr in an age-long war that the Old Ones were beginning to lose. The Eldar were given psychic powers to focus on battling the C'tan, who were apparently unable to protect themselves or their followers from warp energy wielded as a weapon. Eventually, the use of the warp as a weapon defeated the Old Ones' enemies and brought peace. However, with many species' souls being directly linked to the warp now, to give them psychic powers, the once peaceful extra-dimensional realm was thrown into disorder and chaos, reflecting their myriad of emotions as tumultuous energy that stirred the realm into a frenzy. This led to the creation of several warp entities, including the Enslavers. These Enslavers fed on the psychic energy given off by many species, turning the inexperienced Eldar Psykers into warp gates, allowing more of their kind to enter the material plane and feast on the many species, including the Old Ones. The Old Ones tried to fight these encroaching entities, creating the Kork, who would one day become the Orc, and the Jokero, neither of which being linked to the warp directly, but ultimately both failed. The Old Ones fell, and their child species were left to protect themselves. Eventually, with the war in heaven ending and the enslavers mostly sated by the Old Ones' demise, the remaining species struggled to rebuild. The Eldar, being one of the most intelligent and organised of the species created, eventually consolidated their power and began expanding their influence to form the Eldar Empire. No one knows how quickly after the Old Ones' fall this empire came about, but they can agree that it existed for hundreds of millennia. For a time it was the pinnacle of technological and cultural perfection in this galaxy, and although spread thin compared to other empires, their ability to use the webway, created by the Old Ones and extended by the Empire, allowed them to rapidly access anywhere in their empire without having to rely on warp travel. The byproduct of their technological and cultural sophistication was an arrogance that had been hard to match by any other species. They were able to keep the lesser species like the Orc pushed back to the fringes of the galaxy, and created numerous automatons to free them from physical labour, enabling them to spend their centuries of life in the pursuit of pleasures. They lived in hundreds of paradise worlds at the heart of their empire, engineering the planets to be perfect in every single way, providing comfort to any and all who journeyed there. They indulged their every whim. They pursued whatever held their curiosity, turning their vast intellects to everything from art to unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Not even death was feared, for their souls would return to the warp to be reborn into a new body at a later time, the warp being far less hostile and apparently also containing the Eldar's own gods. Initially, this freedom allowed them to create the most beautiful and impossible things, from art to technology, that gave them huge amounts of power against even the new species rising to power across the galaxy. Eventually, the Empire encompassed 10,000 worlds, focused around the core of worlds from which ruled the highest members of Eldar society. No one knows if there was any kind of emperor or ruling class, however they can agree that there was some sort of hierarchy that was in place. However, as time progressed, a feeling of stagnation began to beset the Eldar, with almost everything from labour to military conquest being done by automations, with little input by the Eldar themselves. As time progressed, Eldar society sought more and more niche pleasures to stave off the ennui of their existence. They began to turn to darker pleasures, with hedonism turning into narcissistic depravity and a lustful deviancy that spread across their empire, with the desire to force pleasure from everything becoming a dark beast that gripped the hearts and souls of the Eldar people. This darkness, spread across the empire, led ultimately to its end and the fall of the Eldar into the people they are today. The fall hinged on the fact that whilst the Eldar felt all the emotions that other species felt, and have, they also felt them more keenly than any other species, an almost visceral sensation that reflected in their souls and by extension in the warp. This also meant that the undisciplined Eldar mind had a high capacity for addiction, seeking out the same pleasurable sensations again and again, and seeking to improve this high as it gradually began to become less effective over time. This craving led to the hedonism and depravity of the Eldar species. Their achievements and their mastery also led them to feel that nothing could ever take away their wealth or power. Even the humans, who had risen to almost rival their power, and who had spread across the galaxy themselves, had eventually fallen due to their reliance on warp travel, and who were at the time in the depths of the Age of Strife. As this superiority continued, they slowly began to lose even the smallest reserve of self-control, their society almost becoming a continual orgy of lust and in some cases sadism, seeking pleasure through the domination of others. However, not every Eldar was affected by their emotions this strongly. Some grew appalled at the debauched direction their species was taking, and sought to find a new way of life, away from the new and dark passions of the Eldar people. Some of these Eldar decided to live a more simplistic life, away from the automation and the endless pleasure-seeking. They would live on less perfect worlds, although they would still be engineered to be life-giving and prosperous. They would work the land, build their own societies, and enjoy the simple pleasures of life, ever accessible and far more fulfilling than the empty pleasures achieved by the majority of their species. They were named Exodites for their exodus from the Eldar Empire in its last days. Other Eldar were insulated from the degeneration of society, travelling on massive trade ships. These were self-contained communities, the size of small towns or cities, that spent centuries or even millennia outside their own civilization, which helped prevent their degradation into the depths of pleasure that the rest of their species currently revelled in. As the fall approached, cults appeared dedicated to the coming of a new god, a dedicated elder god of pleasure. These cults espoused esoteric knowledge, sensual pleasure, and sexual gratification, with some even sacrificing Eldar children on fell altars to help summon this new god, to provide them with even greater and darker pleasures than those they already had access to. In the final days, the society began to break down, with many turning to violence as a method of achieving more primal pleasures, ignoring all former social boundaries and revelling in their debasement. Some of the more controlled Eldar began to see the doom approaching them, and converted the former trade ships into vast city ships known as craft worlds, loading onto them as many of the uncorrupted Eldar as they could support before fleeing Eldar space. They were just in time. On the world of Belial-4, the cult there prepared a ritual to usher in a new age of pleasure, taking part in the most debauched and perverted acts the Empire had ever seen, fueling the birth of their new god. However, they could not know that the ritual would be their doom. As their ritual reached its peak, a new chaos god, Slaanesh, she who thirsts, tore its way into existence. It felt such hunger that it immediately consumed all the Eldar souls performing the ritual. Then it went on to consume the rest of the souls it could find. As the shockwave passed through Eldar space, the Eldar there died and were immediately consumed, or went utterly insane, killing all around them and themselves, further feeding the new chaos god. The birth of Slaanesh was so violent that it tore open the largest warp rift in the galaxy, consuming the whole Eldar Empire and drawing its worlds into the warp through what today we would call the Eye of Terror. In moments, the oldest empire in the galaxy was consumed, and the age of the Eldar ended with screams. Interestingly, the birth of Slaanesh had also cleared the chaotic warp storms that had prevented humanity from re-establishing their dominance in the galaxy, and allowed the Emperor of Mankind to begin his Great Crusade. The only Eldar to survive the fall were the Exodites, the Craftworld Eldar, and the Eldar deep within the Webway who would later become the Dark Eldar. The remainder of the Eldar worlds were drawn into the Eye, becoming crone worlds, mad planets ruled by chaos that defied physics, inhabited by ruins and the few remaining Eldar that were now enslaved to Slaanesh's will. Most of the craft worlds escaped, although one, Altansar, was trapped by the odd gravitational pull of the Eye, disappearing into it for almost 10,000 years before returning to reality in the current day, with many Eldar fearing that their time in the Eye had tainted them. It should be noted that even to this day, the Eldar souls are still consumed by Slaanesh when they enter the warp as they die. The only protection is either from using soul stones, used by the Craftworld Eldar, a giant wraith circuit at the heart of their worlds, in the form of the Exodites, or eternally sustaining their life, as the Dark Eldar do, via the use of pain and torture, consuming the pain of others to sustain their own life. The history of the Eldar species diverged at this point, and I will cover the histories of each of the craft worlds along with the Exodites and the Dark Eldar in their specific videos. Although far from taking a backseat in history, the craft world Eldar remained active and have been known to manipulate the Second War of Armageddon, have involvement in the Medusa 5 wars, and are also now involved in the reawakening of Inaid, one of the dead Eldar gods, ironically the god of death, who has returned to this realm via the sacrifice of the Biel-Tan craft world, all of which will be discussed in separate videos as well. So that's everything I wanted to mention about the history of the Eldar today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, please leave them in the comments section, or if you have any suggestions you'd like to provide to me personally, you can do so via personal message on YouTube. Next up, we'll be moving on from the Eldar again and moving on to their dark counterparts, the Dark Eldar. So hopefully you'll enjoy that, and we'll see you next time on the Vaults of Terra.